Hello there, everybody. My name is Greg LeClaire. I am, I guess, what you can call the event coordinator for this year's Big Night Amphibian Migration event. So this is just a training slideshow. And just to cover what we're going to go over, this is just a broad overview. We're going to talk about what Big Night is, some safety rules, the roles and duties of you guys, the participants, how to adopt road segments, because that's where you'll be surveying, how to collect data, and how to identify some common amphibians. So let's get right to it. First of all, what is Big Night? So Big Night is this one specific night, or it could potentially be a bunch of nights, usually that actually ends up being the case, where amphibians, which are frogs and salamanders, come out and migrate in masses, in literally thousands at a time. And they're migrating from their hibernation spots to breeding locations, and we'll talk about those in a second, but big nights are triggered by very certain weather events. Usually it's about 45 to 50 degree nights with rain. You can have movements where it's cooler as low as like 35 degrees, but if you get 45 to 50 with rain, that is a really good time to find some amphibians moving. So if it's not raining or if it's too cold, don't expect anything to be out. So they're moving to these things called vernal pools, which are these breeding locations which are seasonal. They will dry up in the summer, and these are awesome for amphibians because a temporary body of water cannot hold predators permanently. So, for example, fish, they can't survive in this pool forever. So it's a safe spot to lay their eggs and hatch their tadpoles. But the problem is there is something that lies between these migrating amphibians and these vernal pools. And that would be roads. So roads will crisscross the landscape every which way and get between amphibians and vernal pools, and it is very hard to see an amphibian on the road, especially during a rainy night. So that can result in a significant number of these amphibians getting hit by cars, which is a little tragic. What we're hoping to do with the Big Night is to organize you as citizen scientists to collect data on these migrating amphibians, but also assist them in crossing roads. So those are your two primary tasks as volunteer scientists. And this is what our solution here looks like. So hopefully you guys will be having as much fun as these folks are in the rain gear and reflective vests with their signs and buckets and umbrellas, helping critters like this little spring peeper, this blue-spotted salamander, or these blue-spotted salamanders in crossing the road to reach their breeding locations. So to become a volunteer for Big Night, there's a couple of steps you have to take. So first of all, you're going to complete this training just by watching this video or looking through the PowerPoint. Then you're going to take the Big Night training quiz, which the link will be in this PowerPoint as well as provided to you in the description of this video. And that will certify you, assuming you pass, as a volunteer scientist for the program. And once you do that, you'll be able to sign a liability waiver, which is required, by the way. Everybody has to sign a liability waiver. And then you're going to adopt a road segment, and then you're going to survey that segment that you adopted for a total of 3 hours anytime between April 1st and April 30th. So anytime during the month of April, as long as it is at night. So you can do all 3 hours in one night, or you could do like 1 hour one night and 1 hour the next night and 1 hour like later in the month or something. You can split it up any which way you want, and you can do more than 3 hours, of course. More data is something I don't have a problem with. So we talked about this briefly, but your duties as a volunteer scientist, one of the primary ones is data collection. So let's talk about how you collect data. So without data collection, our efforts would be pretty worthless. I mean, we would be helping amphibians crossing roads, sure, but we wouldn't have the data to back up a solution for the future, like building a pass under the road to help amphibians migrate without getting hit, for example. So for that reason, we record data, and all data must be recorded on Big Night data sheets. So here's a link to our data sheet, but if you're watching on a video, you won't be able to click that, so this will be in the description of the video. And it's recommended that you enter the data in the car or with a clipboard with some sort of rain cover, because it's going to be raining and it's going to be wet and you could ruin your data sheets pretty easy. So figure out some sort of system to help keep your data sheets dry. I actually use Write in the Rain notebooks and just write up the same format of the data sheet on there, and that's totally fine with me. And this is what the datasheet looks like, and if you've never worked with a datasheet before, this might look a little intimidating to you, but we'll walk right through it, and it's actually pretty simple. So first things first, we have the date and the time. So the date, we'll just do month, day, year, and the time start is when you start your survey, and the time end is when you finish your survey. And nothing fancy here. Usually scientists use military time, but we won't use military time for sake of simplicity here. And just as a reminder, it needs to be any time during the month of April, and it has to be any time at night. So I'll allow anything half an hour before sunset or half an hour after sunrise. Yeah, I got that a little backwards there. It should be half an hour after sunrise there. But I will say the best time to go out is usually sunset and after darkness too, not before it. The air temperature can be recorded in Fahrenheit, and you can just find that either with your phone's weather app, for example, or your local weather station, or even if you have a thermometer on hand by chance, whatever you want to do. We're going to do Fahrenheit. Usually scientists do Celsius, but again, most of us are going to be regular citizens, so we'll just use degrees Fahrenheit for air temperature. Then you're going to tell us what the weather conditions are like. So I just have three options for you here. Dry, so there's no rain coming down at all. Mist, so just a little bit of rain to a light rain, or rain, which could be regular amount of rain or heavy rain, we'll say. And you're just going to circle one, whatever one describes it best what is going on. And your site location ID will usually be the name of whatever site you adopt. If it's anything different, just make sure that you're getting the correct name down and you're writing the right name down. You could show up to a certain road, for example, and let's say you're on the East Thorndike Road. I think I used that example later. And if you just write like East Thorndike, I'll probably know what that means, but we might have a second East Thorndike site later. So just make sure like you have East Thorndike 1 if that's the correct site, for example. The recorders are primarily the person who, or people who are recording the data, but you can also add the people who will be collecting data with you. And that can be in whatever format you like. I usually prefer first initial, last name. Some people just prefer initials. Some people prefer first names, whatever you feel like is necessary, just as a way to keep track of how many people are going out there and who is recording data, which, by the way, whoever is recording should be the first one listed. Now, when you start finding animals, you will start recording under the species column. So every time you find an animal, it will get its own row. So we'll teach you how to identify the species of animals here in a little bit. And there are also species codes, which I believe, yes, here we go. So instead of writing out the entire name of the animal, so for example, blue-spotted salamander would be a lot to write in one of those little spaces. So you could just write BSSA as a shorthand way of doing it. And then as we continue for that blue-spotted salamander, you're going to write whether it's dead, which would be yes if it is dead, if it's alive, which you would write N for no, or if it's injured, which you would write I. And if it's not apparently injured, you could just write N, it is alive. And of course, if it's dead, just write yes. And then you're going to record the direction that it was traveling. This will help us figure out the important conservation areas for these animals. So if it's traveling north across the road, and maybe a bunch of other animals are traveling north across the road, we'll have an idea that there's something important north of the road. And you can write the direction any way you feel like. It could be N for north, or like, for example, southwest could just be SW, whatever you feel like. You can use the compass app on your phone. You could use a real compass, whatever you deem necessary. And then at the bottom of every page, we just have a notes section if you want to write anything that isn't immediately apparent above. So for example, if there's a lot of cars coming by, that would be something very useful to us. While you're recording data, you need to do your best to move all dead and alive animals from the road because double counting could be a problem. And as scientists, we want to make sure we're getting the most accurate data we can. So one thing I recommend to help you remove dead animals is actually a spatula, which sounds a little silly and a little weird, but if you go and buy like a $1 spatula, that could help you a lot with scooping up some dead animals, especially if you'd prefer not to touch them even with gloves on. If you do use gloves, I do have a recommended type of glove since amphibians are quite sensitive to certain things. So if you don't see that come up later, just ask me about them. And then all the data you collect must be entered online in a spreadsheet. So there's the link to it right there. So again, if you're watching the video, you won't be able to click that link, but that will be in the description of the video. And if you cannot enter data or prefer not to enter data online, you can just give me the data sheets. You could scan them and send them to me, or you could just hand them to me in person. We can meet up, but that is extremely important. That data needs to be collected. Okay, now let's assume you're a few steps ahead, you've passed the quiz, and you're ready to adopt a road segment. Also, you've signed the waiver, of course. So to adopt a road segment, actually, let's talk about what the road segments are really quick. This is what they look like from a sky eye view here. That yellow line, I believe this is the East Thorndike Road that I was talking about earlier. That is 0.3 kilometers long, which translates to, I believe, 0.19 miles, so less than a quarter mile. And that can be walked in about 6 minutes at an average human walking pace. So they're pretty short. And they're meant to be able to be surveyed in one night with pretty great ease. Now, I'd like it if you'd be able to survey the entire segment, so walk from one end to another. But if you're finding more amphibians at one site, it's best to concentrate your efforts where the amphibians are and help them out and take the data there. Now, we select the sites based on one of two things. Either one, we know amphibians are there from scouting runs before or last year's data. So some sites from last year's Big Night will be making a return. Or two, the likelihood of amphibians being there based on some things. Like, for example, that blue dot on the map there, and I'll circle it so you can actually see it right there, is what is called a significant vernal pool. So the state of Maine keeps track of these vernal pools, which house either species of concern or very large amounts of amphibians breeding. So we suspect that there would be a lot of amphibians breeding there, and that they would probably be crossing the road quite a bit, like in this area. So you can adopt either one of the known sites or one of those what's called exploratory sites. And that could be 50-50. Sometimes you could have an exploratory site where you can find a lot or a little, or you could have a known site that, for example, last year might have had a lot of amphibians and might not have much this year. So it's up to you, whatever you want to adopt. I'm totally fine with whatever. However, I believe the next slide here, yes, we have some sites that are listed as priority areas. And so a site like the one I just showed you with the significant vernal pool would be a priority area, and I would like those ones to get adopted first if at all possible. One other thing I want to mention is that there are family-friendly versus not family-friendly sites. So this is what the adoption sheet is going to look like. It's a spreadsheet, and you can see the little family-friendly or not family-friendly right there. And that's for anybody who plans on bringing kids out with you. And we'll talk about if you bring kids, some special considerations, but that's going to be extremely important. Basically, a family-friendly site has slower moving traffic, less traffic coming through, less blind spots, and a fairly good chance of amphibians showing up because we want the kids to see amphibians for sure. So when you come to this, you'll see, first of all, the location name, which is what you're going to write on your data sheet. So this would be East Thorndike Road. That's what you would write. This is the location type, so it is exploratory. So we haven't been here before and haven't recorded amphibians, but it's pretty likely they'd be there, and it is priority. Family friendly, and you'll get a address or two addresses that span the approximate length of the site. And if they're not super specific, and I think in at least one I had to put that you need to contact me in order to get the directions because there was no nearby address. Sometimes it could get confusing, so if you need me to, I can help specify, but usually you got this range here between two addresses to explore your segment. And if you're a GPS person, we have GPS coordinates for the start of the transect here and then the end of it right there. Now, if you continue, let me erase all my stuff here. If you continue on down the side of this page, so scrolling down to the right, you'll see some notes. So this one says that we have a significant vernal pool nearby, which is why it's priority. And in this one, I pretended to adopt it, so I put my name down right here. This is what you'll do. You put your full name and then your email, so I can contact you if there's any relevant information or just to check in on how it's doing. And again, I like to just keep driving this home. You have the entire month of April at night to survey this, so just make sure you get that done. And for now, we're only allowing one adoptee per site just to make sure our sites all get some attention. But later on, if we have some sites that are open, we'll probably open it up to multiple adoptees if you're having a lot of fun with it. Okay, so let's talk about getting into the field. Okay, so first things first, safety is absolutely a priority. And I'm not talking in the instance of the salamanders and the frogs, but your safety. So please do not risk yourself during this project. Remember, it's going to be at night and it's going to be rainy, so you need to be watching out for yourself, be watching out for others, and do not get the temptation to jump out into traffic to save a frog or a salamander. I get that feeling and that urge, but you need to make sure you restrain yourself and look after yourself. And oftentimes those frogs and salamanders are okay. Sometimes they don't get hit, so just don't risk yourself. And if an emergency does occur, please call 911. I do eventually want to know about it if there was an emergency, but don't call me first. Call 911, get the help you need ASAP. Some traffic safety rules. First of all, park your vehicle in a spot that is clearly visible with your blinker or caution lights on. I find that if I put my caution lights on, cars are much more likely to stop and ask me if I'm okay, which personally I'd rather have traffic just continue. I'm always worried about cars stopping and potentially causing other traffic incidents. So I just usually have my blinker on. And what I mean by clearly visible, make sure your vehicle is not just around a bend or just over a knoll. Also, I try to avoid parking on top of hills too, because cars might swerve around it and not see what's on the other side of the hill. So just make sure you're in a safe spot. Now you need to wear bright and reflective clothing. So this is a requirement, actually. See that right there? That is required. So I have safety vests that I've bought for $10 or less. I got mine from Martin's and they came with reflective gloves as well. But I believe you can find them at hardware stores as well as places like Walmart. And they're pretty cheap and you get to use them for all sorts of other things too, especially if you're out at night or working in any other potentially hazardous conditions. Another required piece of equipment is a light source, so a flashlight or a headlamp of any sort, as long as it's bright enough to help you navigate at night. And one thing I recommend too, if you have a car coming towards you, I will usually signal to the car coming at me just by I guess briefly aiming my light beam in front of the car, not necessarily trying to like hit them in the eyes with the light, but just so they can see my flashlight aiming towards them before they get close to me, and that tends to slow people down a little bit. If traffic is coming, make sure you exit the road as soon as possible. That's pretty common sense, but just needs to be said. And then please do not attempt to divert or stop traffic. A lot of big nights throughout the nation will actually stop and divert traffic on certain roads, but that is not our job and we are not certified to do that and not approved to do that. So please just let traffic come by. Do not attempt to hinder them in any way. We do not want any angry individuals for this. Now, when you arrive at your site, again, park in a safe place. Another thing I want to point out is to avoid parking in front of houses, driveways, or anything of that sort. People tend to get nervous if you park in front of their front yard. So just try to park in somewhere that's a little bit more remote, away from people, just to keep people at ease. And then you're going to begin walking the length of your site, so please do not drive through your site if you can avoid it, because if you drive through your site, you're probably going to end up hitting amphibians and just contributing to the problem. So please try your best to walk the entirety of your site instead of driving it. And then make sure you're recording everything you see. And it really helps to have somebody as a designated recorder. There's a lot of stuff that happens very quickly sometimes, so it helps to even switch off too. Sometimes you get really tired of moving amphibians and the other person gets tired of recording data, so having a second person there could be extremely helpful. Now, if you're bringing kids, we have a couple extra precautions, and of course we really welcome kids, and that's very exciting, and we want to expose them to nature as much as possible. But those precautions are, first of all, children should be old enough to understand traffic safety. So if they're like 2 or 3 or younger, they probably shouldn't be out there. I mean, the environmental exposure alone is a little much for a kid that young anyway, but you want a kid who's traffic smart for sure. And also, we are requiring a 1-to-1 child-adult ratio, so every child needs to have an adult with them. That's just because sometimes your attention can get really divided during these nights, and we want to make sure every kid is accounted for. All children also need the same gear as adults, so they also need reflective vests or bright clothing and a flashlight. Again, that's just safety precaution, and I'm sure you want your kid to be as safe as possible. And like I mentioned before, we have family-friendly sites available. So there are some sites that have faster traffic and some, I guess you could say, blind corners. So those would not be recommended for kids, but The family-friendly sites have slow-moving traffic, less traffic, and a really high chance of amphibians. So I definitely recommend taking you and your family there if you want to go out. Now, when you're leaving a site, just make sure you've got everything that you took out with you. Check under and around your car for amphibians. This is one that people don't really think about too much, but usually if you're parked near a busy site, you'll have amphibians all over the place, and they do end up under your car and behind it and in front of it. So just give it a quick check, move any stragglers, and then go ahead and use your blinkers, and slowly and carefully depart from the road shoulder. If that doesn't sound like driver's ed for you, I don't know what does. Now, moving amphibians. This is one of the fun parts. So moving frogs and salamanders, I'm sure many of us have done before, especially in our childhood, but for those who haven't or haven't done it in a while, you need a firm but gentle hand for sure. These are sensitive animals, but they are slippery and do require a little bit of dexterity to make sure that you hold them securely. And you want to try to do it with both hands if at all possible. Right here in this photo, this is one type of hold that herpetologists, so herpetologists are people that study reptiles and amphibians, use to hold frogs. And basically the leg is just pinned right here. And this doesn't hurt them or anything like that, but that will keep them from hopping away. So that's a little bit more of an advanced hold, I would say. You could hold them in like a cupped hand, for example, especially if you have some pretty lively frogs, and you definitely will. So if frog's hopping around in front of you, just cup your hands over it and scoop it up that way. One thing I definitely need to mention is salamanders should never be picked up by their tail. So salamanders do this really cool thing where they can detach their tail when predators are attacking, which is a really cool adaptation. It's really cool to see, but we don't want to stress these animals out more than we have to. Another really important point, these animals need to be facing in the same direction that they were traveling in when you put them down. Otherwise, they'll get confused and they might travel back across the road if you spin them around. Something that I should definitely mention too, especially for families, toads and some salamanders will excrete some substances that could be irritating to the eyes or the mouth, or if they're ingested. If they're ingested, it probably won't cause much for trouble, but it's definitely something that you want to get checked out. You might get foaming at the mouth and belly aches, but if it's in the eyes, it definitely stings. So this won't be with every amphibian, and sometimes they don't always secrete it, but just something to be aware of and to keep washing your hands for that reason. Moving frogs and salamanders, a couple other things for you. First of all, some animals may move on their own, so they might be near the edge of the road and they might just be able to get there on their own. So if that seems to be the case, let them cross on their own. We don't want to stress them out any more than we have to, so just use your best judgment there. And a lot of things that we use day to day could be very toxic or painful to amphibians. So even the natural oils that your skin produces, bug spray especially, deodorant, food, especially spicy foods, and many other things that you use day to day could be very irritating to amphibians. They absorb a lot through their skin. That's why they live near and in water. They need that water because without it, they would just dry out. Things come out of their skin and go into their skin very easily. So that means essentially all sorts of different chemicals could get into them with ease. So just make sure your hands are washed and or gloved. Now, animals also just get very stressed out by being handled. So if you can manage it, try to minimize handling if at all possible. All right, let's talk about how to identify some amphibians. This is the last section. So there are 16 potential species that you could discover while out in the roads, but there are really only 6 that you're more likely to see. And those names will be underlined as we go through them. And I'm not going to cover all 16, by the way. I forget how many we're actually covering, but I'm putting together a field guide for you as well, which will include all 16. So first, let's talk about the frogs. Probably the most common one you'll see out there is this little guy. This is the spring peeper. So he's very small. He's our smallest frog here in Maine, only about an inch long, sometimes even less. And they're very easily identified by this cross on their back. If the size, first of all, isn't clear enough, but this cross right here, so you see that X shape, that's where they get their scientific name crucifer from. It's that cross. Now, they have little tiny suction cup toes as well. So right here, those, I missed it. Those little tiny round suction cups help this guy climb because he's in the tree frog family. And they could be light brown to dark brown, but I've also seen them pink too. So they do have a variety of color. So that will be one cool thing to keep an eye out for. And those ones are the ones that make the high-pitched peep, peep, peep sounds throughout the night. And you'll probably be seeing these guys all over the place. They look like little pebbles, so one thing to be aware of when you're driving into a site is if it looks like there are pebbles all over the road, it could be spring peepers. Wood frogs are another extremely common frog during these nights. In fact, they're probably going to be the first ones to be out crossing. And that's because they have an amazing ability to freeze solid and then thaw out pretty early in the year. Now, wood frogs are pretty dark brown usually. Sometimes they can be kind of tan or even red brown, which is really cool. And that's to disguise themselves as a leaf. In fact, they'll even like try to flatten out like a leaf if you get close to them or poke them. Now, one really good identifying feature for them is this black mask right here, right behind the eye. I have caught some that don't have that black mask, but usually all of them have that. One of my friends likes to call them fancy frogs or tuxedo frogs. That looks like they're going out for a nice night. And that white lip also is another good way to identify them. Now, a lot of frogs will have that white lip, but if it has a white lip and that black mask, you know it's a wood frog. And these guys too sound like they're quacking or clucking when they're in their breeding pool. So if you hear something that sounds like ducks or chickens, that's what these guys are. And they're a pretty average sized frog, about 2 to 3 inches long. The American toad is another vernal pool breeding frog, and toads are indeed frogs, but they have a warty, dry skin. It's not going to be slimy like the other frogs, so if you have anybody with lumps all over their body like that, that's definitely a toad. They also have two extremely large glands right behind their eyes. There's one right there, and here's the second one. Those are called the parotoid glands, and those secrete toxins. It's kind of a milky white substance, and those little bumps all over the body too, like these guys here and all over the body, will also secrete the substance as well. And that's one of the irritating substances I talked about. So if you do get that on your skin, it shouldn't bother you. Just make sure you wash your hands before you touch your face or something like that. And they could be pretty large, 3 to 4 inches long. They get pretty chubby, and they're also extremely awkward in the road. They kind of crawl instead of hop, and if they do hop, it's usually not graceful at all. Sometimes we do get this guy. This is the green frog, and this is probably the most encountered frog here in the state of Maine. Some people call it the banjo frog because of the way he sounds, but they're pretty large frog, and even though they're called a green frog, they have all sorts of colors they could come in. So this guy is kind of like a mix between like greens and browns, but they could also be black or blue or yellow. So they can have all sorts of colors to them. The black and the blue tend to be pretty rare, and they tend to look like this kind of messiness. And that's kind of one way I've learned to identify green frogs, is they just look messy usually. And one thing that we're going to point out in the next slide, so they look a lot like bullfrogs, and the main difference is this ridge here. Here, actually, let me switch my colors so you can actually see that. So this ridge of skin running down the back, that's called the dorsolateral ridge. Now, green frogs look almost identical to bullfrogs except for that ridge. I mean, you can kind of see the other ridge right here. If you've got a green frog or greenish frog and it's got that ridge, you've got a green frog. If you have a green or greenish frog without that ridge, you have a bullfrog, which is this guy. So the bullfrog is our largest frog here in the state, and you can see he does not have those ridges. He's completely missing them. He looks like a large football, essentially. Now, it's pretty rare to encounter these guys on big nights. They usually won't be coming out until a couple weeks later. And they also usually only hang out around large ponds, marshes, or lakes. But sometimes we do come across bullfrogs. And if you have anything that's about 6 inches long or larger, then you definitely have a bullfrog. Nothing else is going to be quite that large. One that does show up a little bit more commonly than the green frog and the bullfrog is the gray tree frog. So these guys are also vernal pool breeders, at least occasionally, and they're a pretty average sized frog, about 2 to 3 inches long, and they have these gigantic sticky toes. It's a little hard to see. Let's see, I'll switch to white again. It's a little hard to see, but those sticky toes, you will feel them if you pick them up. It feels sticky, and they use those for climbing. These guys are excellent tree frogs, and they also have fantastic camouflage too. Like you can see that this one is green, and the other one is gray. Sometimes they could be white, and they blend in very well throughout their environment. So sometimes they could just be hard to see in general. But like I said, sometimes they're pretty rare to find. So if you do find one, that's wicked cool. These guys I think are my favorite frogs here in Maine. A really cool frog to encounter. So if you find one, you're lucky. They do look very similar to spring peepers, I will say. They don't have a good cross on their back, and they're also much larger than peepers. So if you find what looks like a large peeper, you probably got a great tree frog. Now, the last two frogs we're going to talk about are the pickerel frogs and the leopard frogs. And the reason I have them both together here is because they look very similar and they're very commonly mixed up. Now, when you compare them side by side like this, you could probably see a few noticeable differences, like how the pickerel frog, for example, has a kind of like bronze body overall, whereas the leopard frog has more of a green body. But some other things to point out is that the pickerel frog has spots that are a little bit more blocky shaped. You can almost like make rectangles or squares out of them. Whereas the leopard frog has circular spots. That's one way I like to identify them. And then another thing about the leopard frog spot is you could see right around the edge of the spots, there's like a bright neon halo of sorts. And that also helps identify them too, because the pickerel frog does not have halos around him. These guys do show up every now and then during big nights, but if you find a leopard frog, that's especially special. So find this guy because they are a species of concern. So make sure you record that if you do find one. But overall, the best way to tell them apart is lime green or bronze. That's usually the way I go. Or tan, I guess you could say. It's not so much of a bronze. All right, so we've got 3 salamanders to talk about. There's plenty more salamanders in Maine, but usually you only find one of these 3 or possibly all 3 of them in one night. The first one is the unmistakable spotted salamander, definitely a crowd favorite and one that you'll see a lot. So they're all black with yellow spots, pretty unmistakable. You can't really mix this up with any other salamanders here in Maine, and they're just wicked cool. They spend all year underground. They have this cool relationship with algae that can make them photosynthesize like a plant so they can get energy from the sun. Overall, just really cool guys. You'll see a lot of them. Blue-spotted salamanders are also pretty interesting and common in the Unity area, so this is another species of interest for the state of Maine. And they have this really interesting thing going on where they interbreed with all sorts of different species. So a true blue-spotted salamander has more of these blue spots kind of going down its body like this, but sometimes you get hybrids that are like just a slate gray, like this one. So if you have a salamander that's spotless or has some blue to it, it's a blue-spotted salamander. Their genetics are just too complex for us to try to narrow down what hybrid it is. And they can also clone themselves too. There are all female populations out there that are just cloning themselves over and over again. So very fascinating little salamanders. I shouldn't say little, actually, they're pretty large. But the other one that I encounter pretty often is the Eastern newt, which when you encounter it, you'll only be seeing the juvenile, which is called the red eft. So when you see them, they're going to be these bright orange or red salamanders, but they have dry skin. They're a newt. So if you have something that has dry skin, it's a salamander, it's orange, it's probably going to be a newt. And they're pretty small compared to the other ones. They're only 2 to 3 inches long, and they're very hard to see, I will say, compared to the other salamanders that are large and black and slimy. These guys kind of blend in with the road a little easier. Now, one thing I should say, these ones are pretty toxic, so make sure that nobody is shoving this guy in their mouth. That bright reddish orange is a warning color. Now, as I mentioned, this is just the juvenile stage. Their adult stage is fully aquatic, so when you see them, they're probably marching towards a marsh to transform into their adult stage, where they'll just hang out in the water for the rest of their lives. All right, so that was everything. I just want to tell you a few things about the quiz before we go. First of all, the quiz is 20 questions long with 35 points in total. In order to pass, you need to get 26 of those 35 points, and you need to get all of the safety questions correct. Again, safety is priority, so we need to make sure everybody's on the same page with those. If you happen to fail, that is a-okay. You can take the quiz any amount of times you want to. I do not mind if you need to retake it 100 times, whatever you want in order to get out there. There is no time limit on the quiz, so take your time if you want to. Also, I'll say it is open book. I don't mind if you use this slideshow. And it is mostly multiple choice and short answer. I don't believe there's anything else. There's a couple checkbox questions too, but I consider that multiple choice. And if you have any questions about the quiz or anything, just feel free to email me at gleclaire14@alumni.unity.edu. And with that said, that is everything. Thank you very much, and I look forward to working with you all in the field soon.